There are no accidents in this city. Every tragedy hides a secret. Every smile may hide a knife. Tonight, we uncover the shocking truth about Jack and Tu Tien, a love story turned into a nightmare, and the mastermind who thought no one would ever find him. But shadows always leave traces, and justice is never blind. I have walked this road for more than 20 years, chasing shadows and watching how grief shapes people. I thought I had seen it all, but that night when I stepped into St. Mary's Hospital, I knew another story was waiting to be told. The air was heavy with antiseptic and sorrow. Fluorescent lights flickered above and cast a pale glow on the corridor at the far end. Jack sat hunched on a steel bench, his hands locked together, trembling, his eyes swollen red with tears. He looked broken. Beside him, his mother tried to offer comfort, but there are wounds no hand can heal. Inside the emergency room, Tu Tien lay pale against the pillow, her body fragile, her breath shallow. She had been struck by a motorcycle only hours before. The doctors said the baby she carried was gone. Some called it an accident, bad timing, wrong place, wrong hour. But my instincts told me something different. In my career, I have learned that fate often wears a mask, and sometimes behind the wheel or the handlebars there is intent, not chance. The report I read was cold and thin. Two men on a motorcycle struck Tu Tien and fled. They vanished without a trace, no license plate, no witnesses willing to speak. It smelled of strategy, not panic. When I visited the crash site, the morning drizzle still clung to the road. I crouched where the asphalt showed faint skid marks. The pattern was precise, a straight line, then a sharp swerve into the pedestrian zone. Not loss of control, but aim. I brushed the ground and found a small fragment of black plastic, oily and broken, a piece of the motorcycle fender. Small, yes, but evidence often begins small. I walked the narrow street asking shopkeepers if they had seen anything. Most shook their heads. They heard only the roar of the engine and then the scream. But one old vendor roasting chestnuts leaned closer, his voice low with fear. He said the men had been waiting parked at the corner for 15 minutes before the crash. They were not random passers. They watched, and then they struck straight toward Jack. But Tu Tien pushed him away. She took the impact herself. That detail cut deep. It meant the true target was Jack, not Tu Tien. She saved him with her body and lost her child in the process. Back at my office, I laid the evidence on the desk, the plastic fragment, the words of the old vendor, the silence in Tu Tien's hospital room. My instincts sharpened. This was no random crime. Someone had sent those men. I began digging into Jack's past. He was not rich, but ambitious. 2 years earlier, he had been involved in a construction project with a man named Tran. How the deal collapsed, how nearly bankrupt Jack withdrew at the last moment, saving himself, but leaving how in ruin. That was motive enough. How I'd contacts, men who preferred fists and knives to contracts. Still, suspicion is not proof. I needed more. And then another piece arrived. Tu Tien's colleague Mai Lin told investigators that Tu Tien had been worried, whispering that someone was following her after work. If true, she had sensed the shadow before it struck. That night, I searched their apartment. It was neat, too neat, as if staged. In the drawer of her bedside table, I found a leather-bound journal. She wrote about a man she called the Shadow. He waited near the bus stop, his eyes burning into her back. And 2 nights before the accident, a letter had been slipped under the door. 4 words: you cannot escape. At that moment, I knew the motorcycle was only the weapon. The true story was hidden deeper, and the shadows around Jack and Tu Tien were just beginning to reveal themselves. The rain had not stopped since the night of the accident. The city streets glistened under neon light like a mirror of shadows. I had Tu Tien's journal open on my desk. Its words felt heavy. A stalker, a threatening letter, a sense of being watched. This was no accident, it was a plan. I took the plastic fragment from my pocket, turned it in my hand, its edges sharp with oil still clinging to it. If we could trace it to a specific motorcycle model, it could be the first breadcrumb. But more pressing was the soil I found near the window lock of Tu Tien's apartment. It was not city dust, but dark, rich soil with traces of pollen. I sent it to the lab and asked them to check for plant residue, fertilizer, anything. In 20 years, I learned that killers are not as invisible as they think. They always carry something from the places they touch: a hair, a fiber, a smear of dirt. The soil would speak. While I waited, I questioned Jack again. His grief was raw, but his words steady. He swore he had no enemies. He said, how is a man from the past, a failed deal, nothing more. But his eyes shifted when I pressed harder. Grief often masks guilt or fear. He admitted Tu Tien had been worried for weeks. She whispered of a shadow near the corner of their street, but Jack dismissed it as paranoia. He regretted that now. At the precinct, Detective Marquez, a younger officer, worked with me. We pulled phone records, bank statements, connections, how had debts deeper than the ocean, and his name surfaced with gangs still active. If he wanted revenge, he had tools. But revenge rarely moves in straight lines. I remembered Tu Tien's final draft message on her phone. If anything happens to me, look into the one you trust least. Those words were deliberate. She knew danger was close, too close for comfort. The next day, the lab, called the soil, was traced to a greenhouse on the edge of the city. It contained rare orchid pollen, the kind only a handful of nurseries grew. I drove there under the cover of night. The greenhouse was quiet. The caretaker, an old man nervous in his words, admitted he had seen a tall, scarred man a week ago. He asked strange questions about orchids, not for beauty, but for how long they could last hidden without water. The scar across his right hand was clear in the man's memory. I knew that name, Duc Van. He was a former gang enforcer, vanished after serving time for extortion, a predator with cold eyes. If he was the stalker, then someone had paid him. Back in the city, I searched criminal records, and phone traces. Burners are common tools for men like him, but one pattern emerged. A string of calls linked to an unregistered number matched the area near the greenhouse. That same number appeared in the records of Mylin. That detail disturbed me. She was Tu Tien's colleague, her friend, but jealousy hides behind friendly smiles. When I brought her in for questions, she smiled politely, but her hands trembled. She denied knowing Duc Van too quickly. She said she had nothing but respect for Tu Tien, but envy leaks through silence. Her lips tightened whenever Jack's name surfaced. I pressed her. Did Tu Tien confide fears to you? Did you see the man? She shook her head too quickly. Her denial reeked of lies. The deeper I dug, the more the circle tightened. If Mylin was connected to Duc Van, then she was no bystander. She was the mind while he was the blade. That night I set a trap with Marquez. We leaked false news to the press. We said we had uncovered new audio on Tu Tien's phone naming her stalker. We announced it would be revealed in a briefing. If Mylin was guilty, she would panic, and panic breeds mistakes. Within a day, Duc Van resurfaced. Security cameras caught him near the precinct, pacing restless, as if waiting for orders. He would not come that close unless someone sent him. That someone was afraid the lie would catch fire. We followed him through the rain. His movements were careful, always checking reflections, but patience is a weapon. We tailed him until he slipped into a quiet cafe, and there in the corner Mylin sat, whispering urgently to him. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. The sight was enough. Later, her phone betrayed her. Text after text to Duc, urging him to finish it before the police find more. The mask had slipped, and the shadow had a face. The pieces were falling into place, but the question remained, why? Why would a woman betray her friend and risk everything? The answer was older than any gang or debt. It was envy, and envy festers until it kills. The night closed in heavy with rain and cigarette smoke. As I sat in my office, I stared at the scattered notes, the broken plastic, the journal, the soil, the phone logs, and I knew I was close, too close. The shadow was no longer in the distance. It was in the room, breathing down my neck. Tomorrow would be the day. I pulled the mask off completely. The city did not sleep that night. Thunder rolled across the skyline, and the neon lights flickered on the wet pavement. I sat by the window, my thoughts circling like crows. The face of Mylin haunted me. She had played her role so carefully, the loyal friend, the grieving colleague, but the cracks in her mask had widened, and through them, I saw the shadow of envy. Detective Marquez called just before dawn. He said Duc Van had been spotted again near the river docks. He moved with purpose, as if waiting for instructions. We had to move fast, so we set a silent watch. No uniforms, no sirens, just eyes in the dark. The docks smelled of rust and salt. An old rope. My hand rested on the grip of my pistol. I did not expect a fight, but shadows are unpredictable. Hours passed before a car pulled in. Sleek black-tinted windows. It was Mylin. She stepped out, her hair tied tight, her steps urgent. She moved to Duc and pressed a small envelope into his hand. The gesture was brief, but clear. Money or instructions, or both. I felt the knot in my chest tighten. The mask was gone. This was no grieving friend. This was the architect. We did not arrest her yet. I wanted more. I needed her words. I needed the truth, like a confession carved in stone. So we followed her back into the city. The rain washed her footprints, but her phone betrayed her again. Texts filled with urgency. Finish it now. He cannot escape. I returned to Tu Tien's journal and read her last entry again. I feel a shadow near me. Someone smiles with me, but their eyes carry knives. If anything happens, it will be from the one closest to me. Those words stung sharper than any blade. The next morning, I brought my Lin and not as a suspect, but as a witness. I let her sit across from me in the small interrogation room, the walls pale gray, the clock ticking like a hammer. She smiled faintly, but her eyes restless. She asked if we had caught the man. I said maybe, but I wanted her version. She told me a story rehearsed too smooth about how she and Tu Tien had been close like sisters, about how Jack was broken now, about how she wished she could help, but every word felt hollow. Then I laid out the envelope I had taken from Tu Tien. It was soaked with rain, but inside lay cash, unmarked bills. I placed it slowly on the table between us. Her eyes flickered for only a second, but it was enough. I leaned forward and asked, did you think envy would buy you peace? Did you think silencing her would make you more? She froze. The mask cracked just slightly. She said nothing. I pressed harder. I told her we had records of her messages. To Duke, the false news about the audio had cornered her. She was no longer in control. She was the hunted, not the hunter. At last her voice trembled. She whispered, I never wanted it to end this way. I only wanted him to see me, not her, not always her. Those words revealed everything. The motive was not money, not revenge, but desire twisted with jealousy. Jack, the man she longed for, the man she could never have because his heart belonged to Tu Tien. So she turned envy into a weapon. She found Duke, a man who thrived on violence. She promised him money if he frightened Tu Tien, but fear was never enough. Fear always hungers for blood. Her confession spilled out like broken glass. She admitted to following Tu Tien. Watching her at work at home, she spoke of Jack as if he were a prize, a light she deserved. She said Tu Tien never valued him, never valued friendship, but her voice shook with more pain than triumph. I recorded every word, but my chest grew heavy. I had seen greed, I had seen vengeance, but envy between friends cuts deeper. It rots slowly until it kills. We arrested her quietly, no struggle, no scream. She sat in the back of the cruiser staring at the rain, her eyes hollow. Duke Ben was captured hours later, cornered near the docks, pistol drawn, but he surrendered when the weight of betrayal fell on him. When Jack heard the news, he sat in silence. His grief turned to disbelief. He kept asking why would she do this? She was her friend. I had no answer, only the truth that envy has no friends, only victims. That night, I returned to my office, closed the case file, and looked again at Tu Tien's journal. Her last words burned into me. If anything happens, look into the one you trust least. She had known, she had seen the shadow behind the smile. The storm finally broke, and the city sighed under the clear sky. I thought of all the cases I had solved, of all the masks I had pulled away, and I knew this was not the end. Shadows never truly vanish. They only wait for another chance, another heart to poison. But for now, Tu Tien had her voice back in justice, and Jack, though broken, would carry her memory free from the knives of envy. The case should have ended there. My Lin confessed. Duke Van captured Jack, finally able to grieve without fear. Yet something gnawed at me. A detective learns to listen to silence as much as words, and in the silence of that night, I heard something unfinished. I went over every piece of evidence again, photos, bank records, messages. I looked at the cash in that envelope, too neat, too crisp, too large for my Lin alone to pull together. She was a woman of modest means, no sudden inheritance, no secret fortune. She could not have funded Duke on her own. The more I studied the pieces, the more one detail glared. The car that dropped my Lin at the docks was not hers. The registration traced to a shell company hidden behind layers of fake addresses and dead phone lines. This was bigger than envy, bigger than friendship turned sour. Someone else had fed the fire. At dawn, I went to question Duke again. He sat in the holding cell, eyes red from lack of sleep. He smirked when I asked about the money. He said, you think she ran this? She was just a pawn. The real player keeps his hands clean. He leaned forward, his voice low. You should ask who gave her the cash, who gave me the orders. I only follow shadows, detective. The words chilled me, but confirmed what I feared. My Lin was no mastermind. She had envy, yes, but someone used that envy like a knife. They sharpened it and pushed her to strike. I started digging into Jack's circle, the business partners, the old friends, the quiet enemies. Success attracts shadows, and Jack had plenty. His company had risen fast, too fast to avoid making rivals. I looked into one name again and again, a wealthy investor known as Mr. Hong. He had funded projects with Jack years ago, but the partnership soured. There were lawsuits, threats whispered, not written. Jack had won the case, but humiliation leaves scars. I visited Mr. Hong in his marble office. The man greeted me with a smile, too wide, too polished, his eyes cold. He spoke kindly about the tragedy, said he prayed for Jack and Tu Tien, his words smooth like oil on water. But when I asked about my Lin, his smile stiffened. He claimed not to know her, claimed business was all he cared for. But on his desk, hidden under files, I saw a photograph half-covered my Lin standing near him at a charity event. The shadow grew darker. I requested financial records quietly, and the trail lit up. Shell companies linked to him, funds moving in and out of accounts connected to Duke, the pattern undeniable. That night, I could not sleep. I sat in my office staring at the city lights below and wondered, how deep does this go? How many masks still unbroken? Was my Lin only the first crack? 2 days later, I confronted her again. She was pale, hollow from sleepless nights. I asked about Hong. At first, she denied, then her voice broke. She admitted he had approached her weeks before, whispering poison in her ear, reminding her of what she lacked. What Tu Tien had he promised her that Jack could be hers if fear and chaos broke the bond. He gave her the money and pointed her to Duke. I felt a fire in my chest. The true hand behind the curtain revealed. Hong had turned envy into a weapon and greed into a chain. He had orchestrated the fall of his old rival, not with lawsuits this time, but with shadows and blood. We moved fast. A raid on his offices found hidden accounts, messages encrypted, but not enough. He was careful, too careful. When we tried to pull him in, his lawyers wrapped him in armor of paper and law. He smiled as if untouchable. But shadows always leave traces. We found one witness, an accountant who had grown tired of lies. He confessed Hong had ordered payments disguised as consulting fees, money that ended in Duke's hands. It was enough to drag him into the light. The arrest was quiet. The city barely noticed another powerful man in handcuffs. But I saw the look in his eyes, fury, cold and burning. He whispered as we took him away, "This is not over. Detective Shadows do not die, they only wait." Jack sat across from me later, his face weary but grateful. He asked me if it was truly over. I told him the truth. Justice had spoken, but shadows never rest. They will wait for another time, another weakness. But for now, Tu Tien had her voice back, her memory safe. That night, I closed the case file. The rain had stopped, the city lights clear. I poured a glass of whiskey and looked out into the streets below. Every case leaves a scar, and this one cut deeper than most. It was not just crime, it was envy twisted by power. It was love poisoned by greed. It was shadows hiding behind smiles. And though the file was closed, I knew somewhere in the city another mask was waiting, another shadow preparing. And when it moved, I would be there to tear it down, because justice does not sleep, it waits in the dark with me. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like it is holding its breath. The rain had passed, leaving streets slick and shining with neon reflections. Jack had moved away from the old house, the memories too sharp. He tried to rebuild piece by piece, carrying Tu Tien with him in the silence of his heart. My Lin sat behind prison walls, her envy now a ghost that haunted only herself. She wrote letters, sometimes words of regret that no one wanted to read. She had been a pawn, but pawns bleed just the same. Duke Van waited his trial, his smirk faded, replaced with hollow eyes. He had followed orders, but shadows never care for their servants. They use and discard and forget. And Hong, the man who thought himself untouchable, now faced the slow grind of justice, his smile gone, his empire cracking. He still whispered threats in the dark, but the world had seen his mask fall, and no amount of power could glue it back. For me, the case closed, but not forgotten. I walked the streets at night, listening to the hum of the city. Every face could hide envy, every smile could cloak a blade. I knew this truth. After 20 years of chasing shadows, they never vanish, they only wait. So I keep watching, I keep listening, because there will always be another Jack, another Tu Tien, another hand behind the curtain. And when the next shadow rises, I will be there waiting in the dark, ready to tear away the mask. The city sleeps, but I do not, because justice does not sleep. It waits like I do, patient in the silence.